Hello, my name is Connor,
And I'm Jason.
and you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So in preparing our minds for our reading today, which will be in Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 3, what is something that at face value seemed like a small thing you or someone else did that ended up becoming a big deal to somebody else or to you, depending on who did it? For me, this is just, I have recency bias because this just happened. I was at a wedding a week or so ago, and a guy came up to me. And this guy had joined the Navy, I think, and was deep in. And he's been in for 10 years. So this happened a long time ago. Because I'm old, it felt like it happened a day ago. But he was like, hey, last time we talked was before I went in the Navy. And he was like, that was 10 years ago. I'm like, oh, my goodness, But he said, do you remember we sat down? And he remembered the restaurant we were at. And he remembered the conversation. He goes, there were two things you said that I have never forgotten. But the one thing you said, and the one thing was... He said, you talked about what if you were walking in a room and you're blindfolded, but somebody was telling you how to navigate that room. Turn left, turn right, go straight, slow down, this kind of thing. And he goes, I think about that all the time. Like every time I have to make a decision, I think about that blindfolded person. So here's the truth. I have no idea what he's talking about. No. I have no memory of it. And frankly, and if you're listening to this is no insult. I'm just amazed. I feel like of all the illustrations I have come up with in my life, that is one of the weaker.
That's the one
illustration. Yeah, I'm like I've got so much better. But that's what shocked me was the fact I had no memory, which that's not shocking. That happens all the time. But the part that of all the things, like I have 20 illustrations that I feel are kind of unique in my world that I use periodically. This was not even one of them. Like this to me would be a throwaway illustration. I thought for a second, and this guy's saying he frames his life in relation to that picture in his head, which I thought was pretty amazing.
That's good. I like that.
I love the way that Jesus values small, and God in general values small. And then I'm sad because I usually don't credit things unless they're huge. Like if I do something, I'm like, well, that was small, And this story, it's a fascinating story. Partially, I heard this years ago. That somebody, before they told the story, they said, we are about to fulfill prophecy. It's like we are about to fulfill prophecy. And so it's an interesting in that regard. But I'm interested, I'm also interested just in being taught, through this, because this is one of those passages I've read or heard a lot. Mark 14, verse 3. While he was in Bethany, and that he is Jesus, while Jesus was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor, and they rebuked her harshly. Leave her alone, said Jesus. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them any time you want. But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. So there's the fulfillment of prophecy. But to our point, one of the things that really amazes me about this is the dynamic of... There is this, I remind myself all the time, or ask myself all the time, how would this story look if it wasn't in the Bible? And what would amaze me about it is just the idea that I side with them. I side with the wastefulness community.
Yes.
It's like that amazes me. And then when I step back into Jesus, the dynamic that he attaches to how valuable it is to him. How important it is. There's this, humanness. Because the truth is, this is right before the Last Supper. And in Mark's account, it's right before the Last Supper. And so, he will, in fact, be killed in the next, 24 hours or whatever. But following that Mark's timeline. But it's that idea that it I guess it amazes me because Jesus likes to be paid attention to as well.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And that's why I said, if this wasn't Jesus' story, I'm like, this guy's,
this
guy's kind of arrogant. You know?
I think it comes down to like, if somebody is treating us that way, we see the beauty in it. But if we see somebody else we see somebody else being treated that way, it becomes frivolous. So if I decide, you know what, Jason, you've been like so much, like you've just been like a really like important person in my life. I'm gonna take you and your wife out to a steak dinner, like an exorbitant. It's gonna be ridiculously expensive, but like I want you to have a good night, and I want you to see how valuable you are to me and to my family. Like I think one, for me, like if I was in your position, there'd be some embarrassment, but two, like there would be this way of saying like, wow, I'm dishonored. Like this is something that I know is it's a sacrifice for Connor. It's a moment that Connor is trying to share, like how important he is, how important I am to you. But I think that there'd be a natural response, like not from you, but if I see that you're taking some other person out to dinner, or you're spending exorbitantly on them or whatever, like there's going to be this, like, how much could they have really done? Like how much could this other person how valuable could they really be to this other person's life? But when it's my own life, I can see the fruit, I can see the benefit, I can see all that he's done. And I think I wonder if there's like some elitism for the disciples here, that they're like, well, we know what Jesus has done for us, but like, how could Jesus bless you this much? Like, we're the chosen ones here. How could you be so blessed? I don't know if that's that. I might be reading too much into it, but
yeah, it's interesting. I'd have to step back and think. Number one, this is after the encounter with the rich young ruler. So how did that affect them? And in general, where Jesus, subsequent to that interaction with the rich young ruler, he says how hard it is for the wealthy to make it. So he's kind of already devalued money. Yeah. In the parable in Luke 16, he talks about there's a money piece to that, about the shrewd manager. And so that story has already happened in their hearing. It's almost like they don't learn, like they can't compare A and see what happens in A and apply it to B. If it's not another A situation, it completely is disconnected. So their fixation on the finance of it, I'm having a process right now out loud, just that dynamic of, is this a result of them devaluing money? Like they're like, because this seems to be what Jesus was asking the rich young ruler. Mm-hmm. She gave up, I'm sure this seems to be, like her main thing, Yeah. So she's giving up all of her wealth for him, and they're not making that connection. And the truth of the matter is, I'm not suggesting I would either. Mm-hmm. I would think there are people that could use this, and there always are.
Yes.
But yeah, I can see that point. The thing that's amazing to me, trying to hone in on what exactly is that dynamic, though, of how much it blessed Jesus, who is largely, like, it's not the dynamic of it. He's not like, really, I smell so good. It's the meaning of it to him, like how meaningful it is to him that and I don't think she knows he's about to die either, unless she is just really keyed into messages that the apostles haven't picked up on. So that raises a lot of other questions. Sure. What does she know? But the fact that he internalized this, so then I have to think that he knows God is doing this through this woman, unbeknownst to her, of the significance.
That's really good. Yeah, and what that says for what we talked about kind of at the beginning of how we could not even possibly know how our actions will multiply and how they'll extend and how they'll web out to to heights and depths that we could not even possibly imagine. So I just want to make something kind of just real quick. We will talk about next week the surrounding verses 1 and 2, and then 10 and 11, and kind of touch on the context surrounding this. So if you're kind of like, well, why aren't you talking about this? We might be saving it for next week. So what amazes me about this is you see at the very beginning in verse 3 that Jesus is reclining in the home of a leper. Mm-hmm. And you have this image of this woman bringing in something that is so outside of the wealth class established here, and so it is really fascinating when you just kind of begin to picture this: Jesus in the home of an outcast with his grubby disciples, and this woman comes in, and I wonder, is there this piece of like this? For people like who have been looked down upon, who have been the outcast, been like, this is a sign of the upper class. This is something that only our enemies, right? This is the sign of only somebody who that we would consider not as, not a part of our group. Only they could have this. Only they could afford this. Only they could be, using this, and only somebody who is selfish would even buy this. When you come down to it, what amazes me is you have these things that would seem to be on direct opposites. You would think things that would be not anywhere a part of the same movement, of the same action, of the same group of people. You have the outcasts, and then you have this display of insane wealth and insane earthly blessing. And I think a lot of times if we were reading outside the Bible, like you talked about, we would think there is no meeting place right here. These things are directly opposite, right? You can't meet in the home of an outcast, of somebody who's on the lower end, and also there be a space for this display that this woman has. And what amazes me is that Jesus, the thing that bridges the gap is Jesus, right? The thing that makes this okay is Jesus. The thing that brings these two things together, that allows for unity, that allows for like, this seems like such an oil and water situation. And the fact that Jesus is this emulsifier, is this agent that allows for these two things to mix that should not mix. Man, that's incredible to me.
Mm-hmm. It is. I'll be honest, I don't know how many times I've read this. And of course, they say, historians will say, well, this shows up in John and in Matthew, and they're told very differently, especially John's, because John has this woman being Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, and it says it's where Lazarus lived, but it doesn't say, like, it's referencing the city. It doesn't say the town, you know. And I think this is interesting because I've never noticed the Simon the leper. Mm-hmm. And the dynamic of, like, how did I not notice this? But it didn't resonate with me how Simon the leper is probably poor, which if I'm in a very nice house and somebody gives a nice gift, I'm like, that's nice. But if I reflect times I was in Ecuador where I was in a house that's smaller than most people's front room, and say somebody gave me a very nice gift. I mean, I was in a house like this and somebody gave me a tie. That tie was probably $5 American, but I knew for a fact that would cost 3 or 4 weeks' wages. And this family gave me a tie, and I was like, I can't turn it down, but I feel horrible about this. I'm the one that should be buying them a tie,
Yeah.
And I didn't need ties. Nobody wore ties, in what I did. But it's that idea. I never thought from the vantage point of the apostles, and we don't know. Simon the leper could have been wildly wealthy.
Either way, he was unclean.
Right. Yeah, that's true. But just the maximizing of that sense of awkwardness of, you're going to do something like that in this place. That's just another piece of the story that I never noticed.
I think that sentence is like at the heart of being a person of the kingdom. You're going to do this in that place, like in that incredulous sort of voice. I that might be the title of the episode, but that might seem kind of weird on the episode title out of context.
You're going to do this in that place. Let me always do that.
How about you redirect us?
Yeah. So what perplexes me, and there are many things, and it's not helped by what we just said, because now that we talked about this, I'm like, oh, that perplexes me. What does perplex me a lot is the casual nature that Jesus talks about the poor, because I think we carry an enormous amount of collective guilt about the poor. I'm not suggesting it moves us to action towards the poor, you know, but there is this time when poverty comes up in church circles, the normal response is we need to do more. We need to do more. We're not doing enough. We need to do more. I'm not denying that's true. And I have sat through an abundance of presentations, both about foreign works, local works, in general, national, international works, about whether it's, you have this picture of a child given to you and say, this child is very poor. You need to, support them monthly, or whether it's a homeless work, kind of thing. We need to be involved in X, Y, Z. And I'm not speaking negatively about any of those, What I find fascinating, though, is somebody brings up the poor to Jesus, and he treats it so casually. He's like, it's almost like, why are you talking about the poor? The poor will always be there. You can help them anytime you want. And it reminds me, there's a comedian, he was like, I'm always wanting to do good things.
Yeah.
But invariably I'll be like, yeah, I'd love to go help the whoever. And they're like, we're meeting at 7 a.m. on Saturday. And he's like, can't we bring them brunch?
7 a.m. Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, but that's almost Jesus here. He's like, why are you even bringing that up? You know, and I'm like, Jesus, it's obvious why they're bringing them up, because you could fund, we have a local ministry, John 3:16, that always talks about for whatever, 67 cents you can provide a Thanksgiving meal to a person or a Christmas meal to a person. And then you're like, wow, I spend 67 cents or $2 or whatever it is, you know, every day on whatever. And it's like Jesus is saying, that's what they're saying. Basically, they're like, Jesus, we could have done this and paid for like 5,000, you know, Thanksgiving dinners, you know, or whatever the corollary would be there in their context. And he's saying, why are we talking about the poor? Like,
Yeah.
they're always going to be here. And so it seems, again, if it wasn't Jesus, I'd be like, how callous are you? Not to at least acknowledge, yeah, that's an issue. That's important. They're important. You know?
Yeah, and it's crazy when you think about it. The poor are the people of Jesus. Like when, you know, when like people look back, like when secular people look back at the spread of Christianity, like you can trace back like the different thing about Christianity from all other religions was that it spread primarily through the poor and through women. And so like it's funny because it's like these are the people of Jesus from the very beginning. Now maybe in modern America that might sadly be the case, but the people that responded to the message of Jesus so passionately and so vigorously that they would give their lives up were these very same people that Jesus would see in some light could be disparaging or making light of. I think it's really interesting because when we talk about, like, you know, the poor is like talking about the poor and leveling the playing field and raising people up out of poverty. That is something that gets brought up so often. And I think it's good that we talk about it. I think it's good that we make an effort for it. And, you know, it's one of those things that I think anytime I get like down on the day and age we live in, you can look and see that like global poverty rates are at an all-time low. There are less people in total abject poverty than there have ever been in the history of humanity. And like, you can really begin to be like super pumped and jazzed about that. But then you do see other like more evidence of, yeah, there still is poor, and you know, what system could alleviate it more? Is there a system that could totally get rid of it? And there's just something really fascinating that like there's this almost like, I wonder, is there some sort of admission or just acceptance of Jesus going, hey, listen, like humanity, humanity is flawed. Like you're not going to take this, you know, all this year's wages and, you know, distribute it perfectly. You're not going to alleviate all of, you know, all the sins and all the problems of poverty. And so that dynamic is so fascinating because I think as Jesus people, like, you know, we are obviously called and have lived it out for 2,000 years to be the people of the poor, the champions of the poor. But also recognizing that we're not ever going to solve it this side of heaven. So I don't know.
Yeah. And saying that without, because a lot of times you say, hey, we're never going to be able to solve all of this sin. You know?
Yeah. So then I'm not going to do anything.
Yeah, exactly. That's always like, if I say, look, gluttony will always be with us, you know, oh, so you're just going to say we should all run and be gluttons. I'm like, how did you get that from what I said? But I understand it, you know? And I think this dynamic of saying this sin or this inequality or this disparity will always be with us because we live in a fallen world doesn't mean it's God's desire that people go without. And clearly, if you spent time with people who are truly live in a place of poverty, many times they are some of the most joyful people. You know, now what's interesting is in our culture, in the United States culture, you are told over and over and over again, you cannot be happy unless you have these possessions, this wealth, this kind of thing. But in a lot of other countries that don't have that messaging, there's a lot of joy. Now, having said that, I have never been part of any church, any place that weren't keenly aware of how do we help people eat and make progress in their life and have, you know, clothes to wear and place to stay. And I think that's Jesus talks about that in Matthew 25, you know, when you clothe people and when you fed people, you were clothing me, you were feeding me. Or in other places he says, man, just giving a cup of water. He says that to the apostles before he sends them out. You know, giving a cup of water is sharing, you know, basically me with people. So it's not an either or. It's just the interesting that the seemingly, again, if not Jesus, this would be so callous.
Yes, absolutely. And I wonder, is there the sense of like, if the disciples had been like, Jesus, like we know this person down the street that really like could have used this money, like there's almost this like they don't have a specific. They're not like thinking about an individual. They're not thinking about, like, how do I love this person in front of me? It's this ethereal. It's this, how do I attack this big picture, random, amorphous sort of thing. And so I just wonder, obviously not this situation, but would this sort of interaction go differently if it was directed towards a specific person or alleviating a specific concern?
Yeah, that's true. Hey, our Simon, before we go, we'd really like to bless you because, man, what a big deal, and you don't have much money. Jesus wouldn't have been like, stop it.
Yeah.
Stop blessing him. So it's not presented. You got to take this to full context. And of course he's comparing, again, I don't get why this means so much to Jesus. Like, it's a little beyond me why this matters so much to Jesus. But that's the point of comparison. He's not saying don't give to the poor. He's saying get off her back.
Yeah.
She's done something beautiful.
I wonder for Jesus, who, like, we talk about all the time. Jesus, like, I'm going to die. I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to die. This is going to happen. And the disciples keep missing the picture. They keep not getting it. I wonder for Jesus, is this a moment, I think we touched a little bit on it earlier, of just utter humanness, that somebody sees Jesus for who he is, sees Jesus as Jesus, not as like the leader of a movement, not as the great rabbi, but sees him as a human. And it's so close. He knows it's so close to the end that to have that recognition, to be seen in that way, would mean so much more, than it would have maybe a year or two ago, or however the timeline works. I just wonder, as he begins to feel those feelings and those anxieties, like those struggle of what's about to come, is it just that calm of being able to be seen in that way? I don't know.
Yeah, that is really good. It's a really good reminder. Now, again, I don't know if you overlaid the whole chronology here, how much time between this and, say, the Last Supper, because in Mark, you move into that, immediately, where it's almost like this situation, resolves, as it were, and then it's like, it skips. This is on the first day of the festival, verse 12, so there's a skip in time. You'd have to connect other things. But is he feeling, and I think that's a really reasonable thing, is he already feeling the stress? Clearly, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, when he's in the garden, he wants emotional support. There is something about Peter, James, and John falling asleep that is really bothersome to him. And I think if you just make that a spiritual dynamic, then you say, well, Jesus wasn't human. Yeah. If any human's going through such a pressure situation, they're going to want emotional support. And I think to me, that's the amazing piece of this.
Well, and we'll talk about sometime when we talk about Jesus' triumphal entry. But I think, man, all of Holy Week is isolating for Jesus. Like, what is it? Like, I've never been in a situation where I've been like, Rudy carried on my shoulders into something like that. And, like, I'm sure it feels good for a moment, but like to be like seen as like, to have pressures that you will not meet, that you will not meet, to have expectations that you are not meant to fulfill, be put on you, and for people to want things from you that you are not meant to supply. Man, I just can't imagine how isolating that feels. I can't imagine, as even the greater purpose in that of what is to come. Man, how that weighs on Jesus. And honestly, I think we sometimes underplay what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane as you think about how it drags on. And like, if you've had any sort of deadline in your life, or if you've had any sort of like, man, I'm having this doctor's visit and we're going to get the results of a scan, or we're going to get the impending doom that you can begin to feel, and how almost frivolous how frivolous sometimes life, like how like the things that you took seriously before now become, not, you see them as kind of not as important, or the things you get so much more clarity. And I see this all the time when we read through the Jesus last week, is there's this rushing around, there's this milling around of the people around Jesus, the Pharisees trying to trick Jesus, of the disciples still not getting the message, of them falling like over and over again. And I just think about how, with Jesus having the bigger picture in his mind, for somebody to be able to stop in the moment and see him as like, to live in the moment and to love him in that moment, not love him for what he could bring to her one day, not love him, for what she thinks he needs to be for her and for her culture, but just to love Jesus for who Jesus is. I think that sort of blessing, if you've had that sort of thing happen in your life, how impactful that can be.
I want to get to what perplexes you, but man, what you just said there is just, I've got a whole new layer of amazement at how alone he felt. That right there, I'm really taking that with me, because what we know for sure about the apostles, they still don't get it that this is going to end in death. We know that from the garden. They're ready to fight, their way out. They're totally shocked. They still are expecting him to have an earthly kingdom like David or Solomon did, because we know that from Acts chapter 1. And there are still some that doubt.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about Judas there. Some of the 11 still are doubting, because we know they're still doubting when they get to the ascension. Mm-hmm. And so he is still, the more information he gives them, the less they seem to understand. And he's sitting at this table, and this woman, like, this is a whole unlocking thing for me right now. He's sitting at this table, this woman does it. Whether she understands or not, he perceives this as a message from God to him that you are known, you are loved, you are valued, we get it. And his people that he's told over and over again, hey, this is going to end badly, they're all suddenly offended over a misspent money. And I'm just like, man, that would make me so angry.
And so the disciples are missing the picture of who Jesus is, and this woman is getting to play a part in the affirmation of the Father, affirming who he is.
Right.
And we all know, if you spend any time doing any sort of deep dive into the self, of how empowering and how important it is to have other people, to have other entities affirm who you are and affirm the calling that you have on your life. And it is a dead weight on your soul when you have people that are important to you who don't understand the calling, who don't understand who God has made you to be and what you are called to do in a situation. And man, I think that's something that we can, that desire is such a, in a good way, I think that is such a modern desire that we can, if we could really bottle and communicate that would speak to a lot of different kinds of people.
Absolutely. Well, and I would think, I was raised, don't forsake the assembly. I don't know if you're a listener, you may have heard that a lot, don't forsake, and that comes out of the King James translation of Hebrews chapter 10. What's fascinating, though, is the forsaking the assembly was not simply not showing up. It's also talking about if you show up and you don't encourage each other, you're still forsaking the assembly. And it's quite ironic, because I came to many of those assemblies, and all it talked about was, why aren't more people here for this assembly? And that was the absolute opposite of encouragement. So we were forsaking the assembly by being there together, not encouraging each other, which is the whole emphasis of the passage. But that idea of what is encouragement, but seeing somebody else and saying, I want to encourage you, I want to put courage into you to keep walking with God. Here's what I see in you. Here's how I see God working. So what perplexes you?
Yeah, so I mean, honestly, we kind of touched on what perplexed me, but now just kind of reading through it again, there's something interesting that pops up to me. So in verse 8, Jesus talks about how this perfume is being poured out as to prepare his body for his burial. And then she, and then he raises her up and talks about how, she's gonna be famous. She's gonna, like, her name, like her deed is going to be spoken about for forever. Her name, not her literal name necessarily, but her name, who's like her deeds, her actions will live on forever. And it is still so perplexing to me that the disciples are still don't get it. The disciples still grumble. The disciples still, it continues to befuddle me. Like how they don't get it, how they don't understand it. Because think about somebody like the disciples who are just so desperate for power. Like, a lot of them are desperate for power, desperate to be seated at the right hand, desperate to be a part of this new earthly kingdom, to be heads and leaders and rulers. And you would think that something like hearing, like, hey, this woman's going to be, spoken about forever. This woman is going to be a part of my story forever and ever. This woman's going to be, it's going to be a part of it. You think something like that would speak to them. You think something like that would be like, would break. That seems something that could be like almost perfectly, perfectly lanced to break through some of their hard-headedness. Because, like, even selfishly, you would be like, oh, I want to be that. Like, I want to be somebody that when we speak about Jesus, we speak about Jesus, that, I get brought up in the next sentence, I get brought up in the next, whatever. And ironically, they do, right? They do in the situation. But I just think about, like, how it doesn't get through. It doesn't get through in this moment. And, we all have things where we don't receive the message, don't get it. But yeah, I just think about, it is fascinating to think about the minds. We talked about the mindset of Jesus. What was the mindset of the disciples at this point, and what how do they receive this, and how do they Yeah. How do they receive this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. And it's interesting because of the way this reads. Well, we know how one of them received it, and we'll talk about that next week, like you said. But that is interesting. I say often about scenarios. I was raised on soap operas. My mom was a big fan of All My Children, and they would say these really difficult or bombshell kind of things, and they'd be staring at each other, and they would cut to black, and then the next scene you're on to something else.
Oh, yeah,
and I'm always like, how did they get out of the room? They're like, and the child is yours. Hey, have a good Thursday. Like what? How do they? I'm leaving now. I mean,
Yes.
This is one of those scenes where he's like, this woman is amazing, and they're going to remember her always. When they talk about me, they'll talk about her. The end. It's like
did she
finished
slowly
the
back out of the room? Did she slink off to the corner?
Yeah, and of course he is. If you have pure nard dumped over you, you're going to notice that smell for a while. So that raises other questions about when he's doing the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper with them. Are they still like, man, you smell good, or you just smell,
or is there somebody who is allergic to nard? I can't be around Jesus right now.
That's why in the pictures they're always at the end of the table. It's one big table. It's actually a round table in reality, but this guy is I'm sitting way down here.
I like that image. That would totally be my wife. My wife hates the smell of perfume. She would be like, I love you, Jesus, but I got to get as far away from you as possible.
They were like, I could have been the beloved, but that perfume just set my allergies off. So John got to sit next to him because he has no sense of smell.
Yeah, John Dett. Yeah, that's really funny. I like that image. So, just kind of wrapping up here. We'll talk like I mentioned earlier. We'll talk about verses 1 and 2, and then 10 and 11 to kind of context. And next week will actually be episode 50. So that's really exciting.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, I'm really proud of us that we've gotten through. I think we took a small break for the birth of my child, and since the birth of my child, we missed 1 or 2 Sundays, which I consider that an absolute win. And I'm thinking of Hulk and Infinity War. Endgame. Yeah, I'm thinking about that meme. Anyways, tangent. If you enjoy our podcast, would you consider sharing it with somebody? Would you consider, if you have a favorite episode, or, if something sparks something in your mind about a situation in your life that you think, man, this passage could speak to somebody, or not even necessarily a passage, but this way of studying scripture. If you've encountered somebody in your life that you're like, man, they have a really negative view of the Bible, they see it as rigid, they see it as dogmatic, they see it as something that hinders them, that locks them up tight, I would just encourage you to maybe find your favorite episode and share it with them. Hopefully what Jason and I seek to do with this podcast every single time we do it is to be in wonder and awe of who God is and what the Bible is, and this amazing book, this amazing ancient text of many, many different books that have been collected over time, and that somehow beautifully God weaves together in this grand story of his son and of what God is up to here on planet Earth. And so if you think of somebody, I'll just encourage you, take that step. It's a lot easier to share a podcast than it is to invite to church, it's a lot less of a commitment, and maybe a little bit less awkward. But if you're looking for a step, maybe a healthy step for somebody you care about in your life who has a negative relationship with the Bible, I just encourage you to think and pray maybe that this would be an avenue that you could reach them, or that God could reach them. And so if you want to get in contact with us, want to hear more about us, I don't know. Anyway, our hub is amazedandperplexed.com. So any questions, any thoughts you have, you want to share with us, go there. Grace, peace, and love.